We went into the Pisgah as four, and I carried the only other survivor out on my back at first light. And the thing that took the other two left their gear folded on the ground with the same deliberate neatness it used on a dead contractor's clothes, and I signed a document that calls it a training accident, and I am done signing things. The diner on Merriman Avenue has a fireplace they light in October, one of those gas units with ceramic logs that glow orange from underneath and smell like burning dust for the first few hours of the season. I know this because I have been coming to this diner every October for 4 years, sitting in the same booth by the window with a view of the mountain line to the northwest. And every year when they light that fireplace for the first time, I sit very still and wait to find out whether the smell underneath the dust and the gas is going to be there. Today it is there. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I spent 11 years in the Combat Applications Group out of Fort Bragg. 3 combat deployments, 2 of which were classified at a level I am not going to discuss. I have been in places and done things that most people do not have the language to think about, and I am at peace with all of that in the particular way that you get at peace with things that are permanent. What happened in the Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina in October 4 years ago is a different category of thing entirely. It is not combat. It is not classified intelligence with a routing number and a compartment label. It is something that happened to 4 trained, capable, prepared human beings in a forest in the southern Appalachians, and left 2 of them dead by any reasonable definition. One of them gone from herself in a way that has not been recoverable in 4 years of trying, and me sitting in this booth every October smelling burning feathers underneath the gas fireplace and waiting for I do not know exactly what. I signed a document that says I will not tell anyone what happened in those mountains. I signed it in a room with a man who never told me his name and who had already filled in my signature line before I arrived, which is how certain they were that I would sign. I signed it. I am telling you anyway. Becky did not fall in difficult terrain. Pelletier did not have a stress episode attributable to environmental factors. Whatever the Raven Mocker is, it is not a piece of Cherokee mythology filed under regional superstition, and it was not there before we arrived and conveniently absent when we left. It is there right now, on the second ridge in that section of the Pisgah, and it has been there since before any living person's grandmother's grandmother was born, and the military has known about it since at minimum 1974, and they keep sending people in anyway. I want to start from the beginning, not the mission briefing, the real beginning, which is me sitting in a clean room at Fort Bragg listening to a man named Harrison, who may or may not have been named Harrison, describe a welfare check and document retrieval operation in terms so routine and clean and ordinary that my nervous system registered nothing and should have registered everything. The phone call came on a Thursday in early October, the same October as the mission. I had been back from a previous assignment for 6 weeks. I was running. I was not restless the way some operators get between deployments, that coiled energy that needs an operational outlet or it turns inward. I was managing. The call told me to report to a specific building the following morning for a briefing at 0600 to come prepared for a field-grade mission. That was it. I went to sleep. I woke at 0400. I ran 6 miles and ate and drove to the building. The building was clean in the way that buildings associated with contracting operations are clean, well-lit, climate-controlled. A conference room that smelled like printer toner and the specific generic coffee of institutional settings everywhere. Harrison was already there when I arrived. Late 40s, well-dressed without being civilian in bearing. The kind of precision in his speech that suggested he had written the briefing document himself and was reciting it from memory rather than reading from notes. I have sat through hundreds of briefings, and I have a good nose for the difference between a brief that is telling you the full operational picture and a brief that is giving you the operational surface. This one felt like the full picture. I did not question that feeling at the time. I question it constantly now. Glenn Elkins, government contractor, mid-40s. Signals intelligence background attached to a research program whose name was classified above my access level. Off-grid, in the restricted training zone of the Pisgah National Forest, Haywood County, western North Carolina. 3 days dark, no vehicle movement, no scheduled communication check-in met. He was carrying documents that needed to be physically recovered. The mission was welfare check and document retrieval. The terrain was familiar in type. Appalachian Mountain Forest in early October. leaf-off providing good sightlines, an established trail network in the target sector, no hostile activity expected, no civilian proximity within the operational area, 72-hour window. The expected worst case, Harrison said, was a contractor who had gone off-grid due to equipment failure or a medical event in difficult terrain. The team had been selected before I arrived. I have talked about Darius Mbeki before, in a context I cannot specify without identifying a document I signed. And I will talk about him again here because I need you to understand what kind of man he was before I tell you what happened to him. 11 years of service in the unit, weapons-led. 3 combat deployments with 2 documented engagements that produced citations. He never once mentioned in any conversation I had with him across 4 years of shared service. He had a wife named Adaiz. He had 2 sons whose ages I knew at the time of the mission, and which I have not allowed myself to retain because retaining specific information about people who are gone is a particular kind of ongoing injury. I decided 4 years ago. Could not afford. What I can tell you about Mbeki as an operator is that his composure was not an absence of feeling. It was the product of absolute professional competence of the kind that takes 11 years of continuous refinement to build. He had been in enough situations where the difference between the correct decision and the catastrophic one was measured in fractions of a second, and he had learned that calm was the only cognitive state in which correct decisions were reliably possible. I have served beside men who mistake apathy for steadiness. Mbeki was not that. Every action he performed, from the mechanics of clearing a weapon to the geometry of moving through a building, was executed with the complete attention of a person who understood precisely what he was doing and had made peace with the cost of it in advance. He was the best soldier I have ever served beside. I want that to be on record somewhere, even if this conversation is the only record that will contain it without classification. Aaron Pelletier was his opposite in every visible way. He talked continuously and with a specificity that could be exhausting in a non-operational environment and invaluable in a signals intelligence context. He had read every military history text of relevance produced in the last century and had strong opinions about decisions made by commanders who had been dead for 50 years. His sarcasm was structural rather than occasional. He deployed it the way trained operators deploy other tools, with intention and at specific moments, as a way of marking the end of a line of reasoning he had completed and found wanting. He was also the most capable signals intelligence specialist in the unit, by a margin that several internal evaluations had documented in language that was uncharacteristically direct for internal evaluations. His pattern recognition in degraded or complex data environments was something I had come to rely on, in the same way you rely on a piece of equipment that has never failed in the field and that you therefore stop thinking about as contingent. He talked too much. He was usually right. He knew both these things about himself and managed both with imperfect self-awareness that was somehow endearing rather than irritating. He had a daughter named Cora. He told me about her school play the morning of the briefing, standing outside the building eating a protein bar in the cold. She was playing a tree. His wife had made the costume from green felt and cardboard tubes. He was not going to make the performance. He knew he was not going to make it before we even went inside for the brief. Lena Hargrove had arrived at the unit through a personnel process I never fully understood, which was itself unusual enough to note, because the Combat Applications Group is not a place where people appear without full institutional transparency about their routing. She had a Ranger instructor tab, a reconnaissance specialty with more depth in her service record than in any conversation she was willing to have about it, and a manner of operating in the field that I can only describe as a kind of conversation with terrain that other people in the unit observed but could not replicate. She read landscape the way Pelletier read signal data as a text with specific meaning, full of statements and inferences, and answers to questions that required a particular vocabulary to access. Her assessments of actual position versus mapped position, of environmental indicators versus weather data, of what terrain was actually doing versus what a topographic representation suggested it should be doing. She had not been wrong on any operational context I had shared with her in 2 prior missions. These were my people. I need you to understand who they were before I tell you what the Pisgah did to them, because what happened to them was not the product of carelessness or bad luck or inadequate preparation. They were exceptional. They were as well prepared as it is possible to be for the kind of work we did. What they were not prepared for was something that had been operating in a specific section of a national forest in western North Carolina since before the first operational unit the military sent in was born. We drove to the Pisgah trailhead in 2 vehicles before dawn. The mountains were visible against the sky before we reached the lot. The Pisgah running along the western horizon in that specific blue-gray haze that the southern Appalachians produce in October when the nights are cold and the days haven't caught up yet. I looked at the mountain line and did not register anything beyond topographic reference. This is the thing I come back to most often. I looked at those mountains in the dark from a parking lot, and my nervous system registered nothing. The Park Service liaison was in the lot when we arrived. His name was Cordell, heavyset. A hat pulled low, a Pisgah National Forest service patch on his jacket. The deliberate self-containment of a man who had spent a career adjacent to classified activities and learned not to ask questions whose answers he was not cleared for. He completed the access documentation handover with professional efficiency. He walked me through the grid boundary confirmation and the emergency extraction route we'd filed. And then he asked, very quietly, which sector we were heading into. I gave him a general reference. Upper Pisgah, northeast of the cradle of forestry, toward the second ridge line. His right hand stopped moving. Not a flinch, not a recoil. A stop 1 full second where the hand that had been reaching for something simply did not move. His face did not change. He nodded once. He said nothing else. He returned to his government pickup before we had finished gearing up, and he drove out of the lot without looking back, without turning on his headlights, until he was already on the main road. I watched his taillights disappear around a curve. He had a pair of eagle feathers hanging from his rearview mirror. When I mentioned the second ridge, his voice had dropped half a register. I filed it. Local wariness around restricted zones standard, explainable, operationally irrelevant. I believed this. I moved my team into the tree line. The forest changed within 200 meters of the trailhead. I know how that sounds. I spent the first 6 hours of that movement explaining it to myself in ways that did not require it to mean what it meant, and none of those explanations held. October in the southern Appalachians is not a quiet environment. It is an active, deciduous forest with a complex and continuous acoustic presence, whined through remaining leaves, the percussion of leaf litter under small animal movement, bird calls from the ridge, the distant sound of water over rock from any of the dozens of streams that drain off the range. We had been inside the tree line for 8 minutes when I registered that none of it was present. Not reduced, not intermittent. Gone. The forest around us was producing nothing. The silence was absolute in a way that a living forest does not produce silence, in the same category as the silence that a room produces when something enters it that was not expected. Hargrove was on point. She slowed our pace within the first 30 minutes and did not explain why. I noted the slowdown and did not ask. We have operated together enough that I understood she was reading something she had not yet classified. At the 90-minute water break, she came to me and said, low enough that only I heard, that the quiet was moving. Not behind us, around us, at a consistent radius. She said she had been testing it by varying pace and direction over the previous hour. The radius maintained itself at approximately 30 to 40 meters, regardless of our heading or speed. She said it was not a natural acoustic shadow from terrain. She said she had been in this forest twice on previous operations, and this was not what this forest did. I made a note in my field log. Environmental anomaly, sound dampening, consistent radius, source unknown, began at mission entry. I put it in the file, with Cordell's stopped hand, and kept moving. The temperature at the first overnight position was wrong. Pelletier caught it with the wrist-mounted environmental sensor he carried as standard signals kit. We were in a protected hollow that should have been measurably warmer than the exposed ridgeline above us, basic cold air drainage, first-year meteorology. Instead, we were reading 4 to 5 degrees colder than the ridgeline position we'd left 2 hours prior. No geological feature in the topographic data explained it. Pelletier offered 2 explanations in descending confidence and stopped mid-sentence on the third. I sat in the first overnight position and did not sleep during my off-rotation. I lay still and listened to the silence. The silence listened back. This is not a metaphorical description. There is a specific quality to silence that is produced by the absence of sound. and a different specific quality to silence that is produced by the presence of something that consumes it. And by the first night in the Pisgah, I had been in enough environments to know the difference. Morning 2 brought the radio problem. The MBITR system began producing interference at approximately 0700, not static, not the clean, consistent signature of terrain-reflected transmission or a jamming source. A rhythmic degradation, signal present and clear, then dropping approximately 40% of strength, then returning to full, cycling at 11-second intervals without variation. Pelletier identified the cycle within 20 minutes of onset. He pulled the backup units and ran them on secondary frequencies, same cycle. He spent the first 3 hours of day 2 movement performing passive direction-finding analysis, trying to locate a source frequency or a physical point of origin. He could not locate one. He reported at the noon halt. The degradation was ambient, present in every direction at identical intensity. No source, no origin, everywhere, simultaneously. He used the word ambient once, very precisely, and then he was quiet for 40 minutes. The units were not non-functional. They transmitted and received on operational frequencies. But underneath every transmission there was a shadow, the 11-second cycle riding below the unit's own communications like a substrate that had been there before we arrived and would be there after we left. Pelletier recorded 8 minutes of it on his secondary audio capture device. He would spend the following year attempting to characterize that recording as animal vocalization, wind resonance, or geophysical vibration. He would not succeed at any of these. I do not know where the recording is now. I am not sure I want to know. We found Elkins' campsite on the second afternoon, approximately 4 kilometers into the target sector from the first overnight position. He had been gone from the site for 18 to 24 hours, based on ash temperature at the fire ring, the condition of opened ration packs, and boot impressions in the soft soil at the water carry point. His tent was standing. His communications equipment was inside it, undisturbed. His sidearm was on the ground 3 feet from the fire ring, safety engaged, magazine seated, round in the chamber, not a mark on it. He had left in a hurry, or he had left expecting to return, or he had not left voluntarily. Each of those options produced a different operational picture, and none of them made sense given the equipment he left behind, specifically the sidearm. Whatever else a signals intelligence professional in a restricted zone might leave behind when he moved, he would not voluntarily leave his weapon. His field notebook was on the ground beside the fire ring, open. It had fallen or been placed there. I still do not know which. I read it standing at the fire ring with Pelletier at my shoulder, and Becky and Hargrove holding security at the campsite perimeter. The notebook was a standard-issue field journal, the kind required by access agreements for contractors operating in restricted areas. The first 4 days were precisely what you expected. Grid coordinates, environmental observations, equipment status, the professional shorthand of a trained man doing a technical job in the field. I moved through those quickly. The last 3 days were different. Day 5. Elkins noted movement in the tree line to the north of the camp during the 02:00 to 04:00 watch window, intermittent, the kind that stopped when he raised his flashlight and resumed when he lowered it. He noted the temperature had dropped significantly and unexplained. He noted the stream, 60 meters to the east, had gone silent for approximately 3 hours in the middle of the night. He described everything factually and without editorializing. He was a trained observer. He knew what he was doing. Day 6 was compressed. Equipment had been moved between watches. 3 items he had placed at consistent positions within the camp perimeter had been relocated during the 03:00 to 06:00 window. He was alone. The relocation was deliberate rather than random. Items moved to different positions in a way that suggested selection and placement rather than wind or animal disturbance. He noted a smell, chemical burning but organic, possibly biological. He wrote the Cherokee word "kalanu" on its own line, and nothing else. The final full entry read, "Spoke to a woman at the road access point when I went down for water yesterday. Older, local. She asked what I was doing past the second ridge. I told her survey work. She did not appear to accept this. She looked at me without expression for a long time and said, 'They've been up there since before my grandmother's grandmother. You got something they want. They already know you. You go back down. I returned to the camp. I have been running asset development operations for 12 years, and I know the difference between local superstition and local intelligence. I went back anyway. The last line was in a smaller hand, less controlled, written at an angle that suggested it was done quickly or in poor light. It circled the camp for 6 hours last night without making a single sound. That is not possible. I photographed every page. I closed the notebook and put it in my kit. I looked at Pelletier. He had read everything I read and was already doing what I was doing, which was adjusting the operational picture in a direction that our training gave us no framework for adjusting it in. And neither of us said anything about the direction out loud. We moved to the secondary grid in silence. The second overnight position was established with everything we had. Full 360-degree perimeter crush wire on all 4 avenues of approach. IR motion sensor on the northern sector where the canopy gave us the worst natural visibility. Overlapping NVG coverage with no gap between sectors. I walked the perimeter myself after it was set and I was satisfied. Every access point accounted for, every sector covered. I posted Mbeki on first watch because Mbeki's watch was the standard I measured everything else against, and I went into my sleep rotation with the flat certainty of a man who had done everything the training provided. At 0300, Mbeki woke me with his standard pattern, a hand on my shoulder, a specific pressure, nothing else. I was oriented in approximately 4 seconds. Mbeki did not move to his sleep position. He remained crouched at the watch point and waited for me to come to him. I went to him, he said, in the exact voice he used to report a fence line on a movement route or the bearing of a secondary water source. That at approximately 0147, he had observed something standing at the southeastern edge of the perimeter. He said it was inside the perimeter. He said it was not a man. He said he had it in his NVG field of view for approximately 4 seconds. He said it was gone, not that it had moved, that it was gone. I did a full perimeter check. Crush wire intact on all 4 approaches. IR sensor no logged motion event in the 0100 to 0200 window. Leaf litter inside the perimeter in every sector, undisturbed. Nothing had come in. Nothing had left. Something had been inside a perimeter that had not been breached, and Mbeki had seen it. And the equipment confirmed that nothing had been there, and Mbeki had seen it. I wrote in my field log, security observation, 0147, southeastern sector, reported by Sergeant Major Mbeki. Perimeter measures intact. No physical evidence of intrusion. Direct visual contact confirmed. I stared at that for a long time. The training has a term and a response protocol for perimeter breach, for perimeter compromise, for perimeter loss. It does not have a term for what I had just written. I was not afraid in that moment. I want to be precise about that because I think it matters. Fear, as an acute response, requires a recognized threat, and what I felt sitting in that watch position was not fear but something older and more attentive. A shift in the quality of my awareness from trained vigilance to something that my training had informed but not produced. The part of the brain that operates under training stepped aside, and a different part took over. I was paying the particular kind of attention that, in my experience, is only triggered by something that has already decided to pay that kind of attention to you. The third morning began with the smell before light, before stand to, in the last shallow layer between sleep and waking, burning feathers. Not wood smoke, not the dry organic char of a wood fire. The specific, dense, protein-rich biological burning of keratin and follicle and the oils in living material, the smell of something that is made of the same things living creatures are made of and is burning. Internally, continuously. I had smelled burning feathers once before, at a chicken farm fire near Fayetteville when I was 19 years old visiting my cousin. I am not confused about what this smell is. I have never in my life been confused about what this smell is. What confused me was that it had no direction. I turned my head and the intensity did not change. I moved 15 feet to my right and the intensity did not change. The smell was ambient, present at every point within the perimeter at identical strength, with no vector pointing toward a source. Hargrove was already awake. I could tell by the specific quality of her stillness, which is different from sleeping stillness in ways I learned to read on prior missions. I saw her make the same slow assessment I had made, head turning, no directional result. She looked at me. I looked at her. Pelletier was already producing the environmental sensor from his kit. He ran an ambient air sample and watched the display for 45 seconds. He said, in a voice that was very flat and very specific, that the sensor was returning a reading on a complex organic compound it could not classify, not a false positive from a known substance, not sensor error. A genuine reading of something present in the air that the sensor's database had no entry for. He folded the sensor. He said, Kalanu Akieliski, the Cherokee name. He said he had been carrying a folklore brief on the Pisgah region as standard background intelligence on the operational area and had assembled it before departure and filed it as background color. He said he had been reading it differently for the past hour. He said, the oral tradition describes a smell associated with its passage, biological, not chemical, internal to the being itself, a constant signature of its presence, not produced by fire or any external source. He said, the tradition places it at the second ridge, most active in October when the leaves are off the trees. He said, the behavioral sequence described in the tradition is as follows. First, it circles at distance, learning the target's patterns. Then it tests the perimeter. Then it moves inside. He said all of this in the voice he used for signals intelligence reports. Flat, precise, each statement placed after the previous one with professional deliberation. Nobody challenged the framework he had just constructed from a piece of regional folklore he had previously filed as irrelevant because nobody in the team had a better framework. And we had all been building toward the same one from different directions for 2.5 days. Mbeki said, after a long pause, that he had not slept during his off-rotation. None of us had anything to add to that. We moved to the second objective grid. 3 kilometers uphill into the section of the Pisgah, where the established trail network ends, and the old-growth forest takes over hemlock and yellow birch, with trunks wide enough that 2 men couldn't wrap their arms. Around them, the canopy dense enough that even with the October leaf-off, the sky was interrupted rather than visible. The silence was still there, the radius still moving with us. But on the third morning it was qualitatively different from the first 2 mornings, no longer the absence of forest sound, but a presence underneath the absence, something in the silence that was actively attending to us. The way a room that is quiet because it is empty differs from a room that is quiet because everyone in it has stopped talking. We found the gear line 2 kilometers into the third day's movement. 9 pieces of military equipment, arranged in a line perpendicular to our direction of travel at exact, even intervals across the width of the trail. I have used the word arranged deliberately because placed would be accurate but insufficient. The precision of the positioning was not the rough placement of someone setting down equipment to mark a position. The intervals between items were consistent to within a few inches. Each item was oriented in a specific direction. It was the arrangement of something that had taken its time. Pelletier walked the line and identified each piece. An AN, PRC, 77 radio in a canvas carrier, manufacture date 1971. An entrenching tool, 1972. A 1-quart canteen in an aluminum carrier, 1974. A fragmentation grenade with the pin intact and the spoon unsecured in a position that would require deliberate care to achieve. 3 pairs of jungle boots in standing position, not lying on their sides, upright, as if ready to be stepped into, dated to 1973 and 1975. A lensatic compass placed face up on a flat section of exposed rock. A field dressing kit in its original packaging, dated 1987. None of it was damaged. None of it showed the oxidation or the biological growth or the material degradation that military equipment exposed to a wet mountain environment for decades should show. It had been maintained. Something that had been in this section of the Pisgah since before any of these items were manufactured had found them across 3 separate operations spanning 30 years and brought them to this point on this trail and arranged them in a line. Pelletier ran the grid coordinate against historical operational records via his satellite uplink. He got 3 entries. Classified operations in this specific sector: 1,974, 1,989, 2003. No after-action reports attached to any of them. No personnel rosters. No incident documentation. Each entry closed with a single administrative notation. Concluded. He said the word 3 times, once when he read the first entry, once when he confirmed the second, once when he verified the third. After the third time, he set his tablet on the ground beside the gear line and did not pick it up for a while. I looked at the arranged equipment and I looked at the mountain above it, at the tree line where the old growth began and the sky went away. I thought about the arithmetic 3 operations, each roughly 15 years apart, each one classified at the same level as ours. Each one closed with a word that was supposed to mean finished, and instead meant something the institution had decided not to put more specific language to. Someone had approved our mission with access to the history of this sector, not despite that history. With it on the table, in front of them, 3 prior operations documented with a word that kept failing to mean what it was supposed to mean. And they had written up a 4th mission anyway, and sent us in. I thought about the contractor Elkins, alone in this forest for 6 days, going down to the road for water and meeting an old woman who looked at him for a long time and told him to go back down and then watching him go back up. I thought about Cordial's hand stopping. I thought about the eagle feathers in his rearview mirror, and about the people who live in the valley below the second ridge and who have not gone above it in October in living memory, and about what it means to have that specific knowledge passed down through generations, embodied in the daily practice of not going somewhere. We keep sending people. Pelletier read from the folklore brief while we moved. He had assembled it as routine background intelligence and filed it without emphasis, and he had been rereading it since before dawn. He read it aloud in a flat, professional voice, the voice he used for intelligence reports. The raven mocker, in Cherokee tradition, is not a creature in the conventional sense of a dangerous animal. It is a being of predatory intelligence. The tradition describes a specific and deliberate selection process. It identifies the isolated, the weakened, the separated, the dying. It does not act on instinct or opportunism. It assesses, it observes, it learns the target's patterns and rhythms before it acts. The oral tradition describes what is essentially a surveillance phase, followed by an access testing phase, followed by a final action. The smell of burning is present throughout the entire record. It is described as biological, internal, the smell of the being's own nature, not of anything external. Something that carries it everywhere, continuously, as a physical property of what it is. The tradition describes its understanding of human group structure explicitly. It identifies the most isolated, most deteriorated, or most separated member of a group and addresses that member before the others. It prefers the dark hours before dawn. It is most active in October when the leaves are off the trees and the sight lines are open. Pelletier read this in a flat voice and folded the brief. He said, "It went for Elkins because Elkins was alone for 6 days." He said, "Among the 4 of us, there are now members who are more and less deteriorated and more and less isolated." He did not complete the assessment. He did not need to. Before the satellite uplink died completely, Pelletier made one final access attempt. Personnel counts for the 3 prior operations in this sector. 1,974. 8 personnel, 4 documented as training accident fatalities, 4 listed as transferred to other assignments. 1,989. 6 personnel, 2 fatalities, 4 transferred or medically separated. 2,003. 5 personnel, 2 fatalities, 3 transferred. He read the numbers aloud in a specific order and let the math finish itself. 3 operations, consistent casualty rates, identical mission structure to ours, the same sector, the same classification tier. He said, "Someone upstream approved this mission knowing the sector history." The satellite uplink died. We were in full communications blackout from that point forward. Pelletier had been producing shorter and shorter operational responses for 6 hours before he sat down. The deterioration was gradual enough that it was readable in retrospect, and not in real time. His tactical function was intact. He was navigating, running comms checks on the dead satellite link with the procedural discipline of a man who does not stop running a protocol because it has stopped working. But his sentences had been shortening since the gear line, compressing from the full analytical statements that were his operational baseline into single-word confirmations. and I had been tracking this without identifying it as something other than tactical focus. At 1,430 on day 3, 2 kilometers from the final objective, he sat down. Not seeking cover, not executing a controlled halt. He sat down in the middle of an exposed stretch of trail, in a position with no tactical value, and placed his rifle across his knees, and looked at a fixed point in the middle distance, and began speaking in a calm, level, specific voice about his daughter's school play. Her name was Cora. She was 7 years old. She was playing a tree. The costume had been made by his wife from green felt and cardboard tubes, and he described the costume with the same precision he applied to everything: the seams, the color of the green felt, the way it moved when Cora walked, the expression on her face at the dress rehearsal that his wife had photographed and sent him while we were in pre-mission prep. He described the expression specifically. He described his wife's text that accompanied the photograph. He talked for 11 minutes. He was completely coherent. Every word was correctly placed. His voice was entirely calm. His eyes were tracking. He was somewhere else. Hargrove looked at me. I looked at Mbeki. Mbeki looked at Pelletier, and then at the 2 kilometers of terrain that still lay between us and the final objective, and then at me. I left Hargrove with Pelletier. I did not want to leave Hargrove with Pelletier. I did not have another option that produced a worse outcome than the option I had. Mbeki and I pushed the final 2 kilometers. Pelletier's voice carried for the first 400 meters, still calm, still specific, still describing the green felt. The terrain and the distance took it before we reached the 800-meter mark. I walked the remaining distance, carrying the absence of that voice, the way you carry the weight of a decision you have made and cannot undo. Mbeki walked beside me. He had not spoken since the satellite died. His sector coverage was correct, and his weapon handling was correct, and whatever was happening behind his eyes was not visible in his hands. The clearing was in old-growth hemlock, approximately 40 meters in diameter. The trees at the edge were large enough that they reduced the fading afternoon light to a dim brown-green at ground level. We entered from the southern edge, spreading to provide mutual coverage of the clearing floor. No sign of struggle at the perimeter, no disturbance of the leaf litter, no marks on the trees, no broken vegetation. The clearing itself was undisturbed. In the center of the clearing, on a section of flat, exposed limestone, were Glen Elkins' clothes. Every piece, folded with a precision that required deliberate, unhurried attention to achieve shirt in thirds and then halved, sleeves exactly aligned, trousers folded with legs parallel, pocket flaps smoothed flat. His undershirt beneath the shirt pressed into the same fold. His socks had been placed inside the boots. The boots were beside the folded clothing. Left boot left and right boot right, laces tucked neatly inside rather than tied. His watch was placed on top of the folded clothing, face up, crystal unbroken, still running. I stood at the edge of the limestone and looked at Elkins' watch and understood several things simultaneously. The first was that whatever had removed Elkins from his clothing had taken its time. The second was that the taking of time was intentional. The folding was not efficiency, it was demonstration. The third was that nothing about this clearing had been random for a long time. I began documenting photographs of the folded clothing, the watch, the boot placement. The documentation was methodical because my training was operational, even in conditions that exceeded it. I moved around the limestone, photographing from different angles, maintaining awareness of Mbeki in my peripheral vision as he covered the northern quadrant. I was photographing the boots from a low angle, when I became aware that Mbeki was no longer behind me. I did not hear a sound. There was no sound, not a footstep in the leaf litter, not a displacement of air, not the sounds that a body makes when it moves against its will, the grunt of impact, the scrape of boot on ground, the percussion of weight shifting. Nothing. I turned, and Mbeki was not there. His equipment was at the eastern edge of the clearing. His rifle, his plate carrier, his radio, his helmet, arranged beside each other with the same deliberate neatness as Elkins' clothing. The plate carrier laid flat, the rifle beside it with the muzzle in a specific direction, the helmet at the end of the line with the NVG mount folded down, everything intact, nothing damaged, everything arranged. I stood in that clearing and processed this for approximately 8 seconds, which is a long time to stand still. The thing had been in the clearing with us from the moment we entered it. It had been present while I photographed Elkins' watch, while Mbeki covered the northern sector. It had operated inside the space that two trained and alert Special Forces operators occupied without triggering any of the sensory and procedural awareness that 11 years of training had built into each of us. And it had taken Mbeki with the same ease and the same silence and the same deliberate neatness and left his equipment placed as evidence. From above the closed hemlock canopy, directly above the clearing, from no point at ground level or in the trees around the clearing's edge, came a sound. I have been trying to describe this sound for 4 years, and I have not been able to make language do what I need it to do. It had the acoustic structure of a human voice. The pitch range and the breath pattern and the cadence of it were human. If you had a spectrogram of it, you would see a waveform that resembled human vocalization. The interior of it was not human. A human scream carries something inside it. A person, a specific nervous system in a specific extremity of experience. A quality that you recognize when you hear it, because it comes from something like yourself, and your nervous system responds to it as such. This had the shape of a scream, and nothing inside it. The vessel without the content. The acoustic structure of human distress, from which the human part had been cleanly removed. I ran. I am not going to reframe that or contextualize it or describe it as a tactical withdrawal. I ran. I ran in the direction away from the sound, and I ran through terrain I could not fully see in the diminishing light, and I ran at a pace I did not know my body was capable of maintaining for the distance. I maintained it, and at no point in the running did I have a conscious plan or a destination beyond a way. I found Hargrove 200 meters from the clearing perimeter. She was sitting in a circle she had drawn in the dirt. The circle was approximately 4 feet in diameter. Traced with a stick or her finger, the groove was shallow, a scrape in the leaf litter and the surface soil. Her rifle was placed at the center of the circle, muzzle down, standing. Her hands were on her knees. She was looking at a fixed point approximately 3 feet in front of her, slightly below eye level. Pelletier was not there. I said her name. Her eyes tracked to me and away. I said her name again. Her eyes tracked to me and held for 2 seconds, and then went back to the fixed point. She was present, she was tracking, she was blinking, her breathing was regular. She was not going to move from the circle. I did not have the capacity in that moment to process what the circle meant, what it represented to her, what drawing it had cost her and what staying inside it was preserving. I did not have the time. I got my hands under her arms and I lifted her. For approximately 4 seconds, every muscle in her legs and torso locked against the removal, a rigid, complete resistance that was not struggling, not fighting, not panic, but the absolute refusal of something that believes it is protected to leave its protection. Then something released, and she went cooperative but passive, her weight full and unassisted, her feet not finding the ground. I carried her. I carried her on the emergency extraction route, 900 meters of Appalachian terrain in fading light, at a pace that was not fast enough and was all I had. My left knee went at 300 meters on a lateral slope, the medial collateral, a clean structural failure that produced a specific and unignorable pain that I processed and moved past. My right knee went at 700 meters in a way that 2 subsequent surgeries have described to me in structural terms that I do not need to repeat here. I did not stop. Lena Hargrove weighed 138 pounds. I carried her 900 meters, and it took me 41 minutes, and I know this because I checked my watch when I lifted her, and I checked it again when we hit the road. We reached the road at first light. I will tell you what the official report says. Then I will tell you what the official report omits, and what the omissions reveal about what the institution was protecting and why it was protecting it. The report, produced 6 weeks after extraction and classified at a level I am telling you exists without specifying it, states as follows: Staff Sergeant Darius Mbeki, training accident fatality. Fall in difficult terrain under low visibility conditions. Body unrecoverable due to environmental factors. Sergeant First Class Aaron Pelletier, training accident fatality. Fall in difficult terrain. Body unrecoverable. Chief Warrant Officer Lena Hargrove, acute stress reaction attributable to environmental and operational factors, medically evaluated, no long-term duty status impact documented. The narrator, mission-related psychological strain, no long-term duty status impact, returned to operational assignment. Glenn Elkins, civilian contractor, lost in adverse conditions during unsupported field operations, presumed fatality, body unrecoverable, document recovery mission, partially successful. I signed this document in a room with a man who identified himself by a functional title rather than a name, and who had already typed my name into the signature line before I arrived. The pre-populated signature line is the detail I return to most often. They knew I would sign. They knew this before I sat down. They sent people into the sector in 1974, and they documented it as concluded. And 15 years later, they sent more people in and documented that as concluded. And 15 years after that, they sent more people in, and 15 years after that they sent my team in, and they knew before I sat down in that room that I would sign the document they put in front of me, and they were correct. I signed it. Hargrove was medically separated from service 6 months after the incident. The formal reason on record is a generalized anxiety disorder inconsistent with continued operational duty. She lives in rural East Tennessee on a piece of land she purchased in cash. The last person I know who had contact with her told me she had built a structure on the property herself and that she maintained no telephone and no regular contact with anyone from her previous life. I was told she does not go into the woods at the back of her property. The woods there run up toward a ridge. I have not asked which ridge. Pelletier's family received survivor benefits and a visit from a casualty assistance officer who described a training accident in the kind of language that describes a training accident. His daughter Cora, who played a tree in her school play, was told her father had died doing something important. His wife called me once, approximately 2 years after the incident. She asked me what had actually happened. I told her he was the best signals intelligence specialist I had ever worked with, and that his death was a loss the unit would not easily replace, and that I was deeply sorry. She said she already knew all of that. She said she wanted to know what had actually happened. I could not tell her. I had signed something. I did not tell her that, either. I am telling you now because I am telling this to no specific person in the specific sense that makes the document I signed applicable, which is the logic I use to get through the nights. Mbeki is on the memorial at the unit. His name, his rank, his years of service, the correct date of death, a cause of death that is a specific and deliberate lie. I attended the memorial ceremony. I stood in front of the wall and looked at his name, and I thought about Adaez, and about his 2 sons, and about the specific way he stood when he was scanning a sector shoulders forward, knees soft, weight forward on the balls of his feet, and I thought about the 8 seconds I stood in the clearing before I turned and found his equipment placed at the edge of it. I thought about whether he made a sound I did not hear, or whether he made no sound at all. I think about this every day. I will think about it every day for the rest of whatever this is. The institution has been sending teams into that sector since 1974. Perhaps longer. I have seen 3 prior operational records and I do not know what existed before 1974 or whether the records I saw were comprehensive. Someone with access to that history approved our mission. Someone with access to 3 prior operations, each closed with the same word, each producing the same casualty rate, each returning whatever survivors it returned to a life shaped permanently by what they experienced in those mountains, made the decision to send in a 4th team and construct a welfare check and document retrieval cover story, clean enough that I sat in a briefing room and registered nothing. I have a theory about why they keep sending people. I am not going to state it here. It is the kind of theory that once stated cannot be unstated, and I have decided that I have contributed enough to the record of things that cannot be unstated. The fireplace in the diner is putting out a steady heat now. The wood smoke is clean and seasonal. The smell underneath it is what it is, and I know what it is, and I know the difference between wood smoke and burning feathers. I have known that difference since I was 19 years old, and I will know it until I am no longer capable of knowing anything. I put a 20 on the table for a $4 coffee. I put on my jacket. I do not look at the mountain line through the window as I walk to the door. I push the door open and step out into the October air and get into my truck. I drive. I keep my eyes on the road in the rear view and I do not look at the mountains. Approximately 40 seconds on the on-ramp, the Pisgah comes into the top left corner of my windshield. The second ridge is where it always is. Blue-gray, enormous, patient. The kind of patient that does not require anything from time because it has more of it than anything that moves through it. I keep driving. The Cherokee have known what is on that ridge since before any of us arrived in these mountains. The people in the valley below it have known it in their bones and their daily choices for generations. The old woman who spoke to Elkins at the road access point knew. Cordell knew. Every person who has lived in the shadow of that ridge and chosen not to go above it in October has known in the specific, practical way that knowledge becomes when it is old enough and specific enough to be a rule you live by. The military has known it since 1974. They filed it under a word that means nothing and send more people anyway. They will send more people. The Raven Mocker will be there when they arrive. The reports will say concluded,